evidence-based entrepreneurial tool set, number 2, is how to make data-driven decision-making. And that's what we're going to start talking about today. So there's a good quote here that I happen to love, actually, which is by the former CEO of Netscape. And he says, if we have data, let's look at the data. If we have opinions, let's just use mine. And I think it's right. Ultimately, like, making decisions based on opinions is a recipe for disaster to start up. And so I'll tell a little bit of a story about one of my examples here. Is we actually decided, we made a decision in my last company, Zarly, to essentially pick a photograph for the front page based on everyone's opinion of it. And then we threw in a freebie in there. So we had 4 different photos on the first page, and the goal was to see what would basically get more people to click through. So we all had our opinions, and then we threw in a random one, just a totally random one that none of us had liked. So there was 3 that we had kind of all said, yeah, I kind of like those one, and the 4th one that was kind of random. If you can guess, I mean, obviously you can probably guess by the way that I led this in, the one that had the highest click-through rate was the random one. Opinions don't necessarily matter in a lot of this stuff. It's actually using data to find out what the right answer is. So just an important thing to know here, as you're doing this, you have to check your ego at the door as you're an evidence-based entrepreneur, is that you don't know. You form a hypothesis, and you test to see whether you're right or wrong. But making a decision uses the same steps here. And we're going to talk about it and specifically how we would name a company, and we'll spend some time again at the end doing this specifically with one of your companies here. But we're going to start with formulating a question, building out kind of the hypothesis, what your prediction, what you think will happen. You'll oftentimes see how wrong you are, but ultimately it's testing it and then using analysis at the end. So we'll talk a little bit about how it works, but just 2 examples that I'm going to talk about in class today are a concept I call lean naming and lean logoing. And these are 2 real-life examples that we'll talk through in specifics. But this is actually how we deploy the scientific method in actually the process of naming a company. So let's use a case study here that we're going to talk about, and the concept is around business loans. So last spring I decided with a couple MBA students to test a few concepts. These were not businesses that we were necessarily going to start, but more than anything these were ways that we could test some of these concepts. So we decided to look at the space of small business lending. So that was our broad hypothesis, that there had to be a better way to help businesses get loans online. So we essentially decided to set up, with two other MBA students, to set up a loan brokerage company for small businesses, meaning we would be a full-service kind of way for small business owners to get loans. And we were testing to see how this would work. Now there's obviously like small competitors out there, mom and pop shops who handle this kind of stuff, but it's a $500 billion market. It's huge, small business lending, so we thought that would be interesting. And to do it, we decided to test all of these principles. So we're going to talk about how you can actually use the scientific method to make data-driven decisions, and we're going to use the case study here about how we did it by actually naming this company. This is how we kind of got to this point here for this company concept that we're going to talk through here a little bit. We actually started with about 60 interviews of small business owners to ask them about the loan process, and 15 lenders. So we looked at banks and the whole 9 yards. Ultimately, we did over 100 surveys at the end of that to find out what kind of things we should do. So we'd done all the validation to know that there was a there. So as I talked earlier, we're kind of at the point where we've got a concept worth pursuing. So as your example of your helping people listen to the television set when they're at a noisy place, we've got the validation that there's something there worth pursuing. What it is, we don't know yet. So we decided, let's pick a name. And this is the process that we all go through. With my last company, Zarly, the way that we actually did it was we said we want to make something that's kind of like a bazaar, and then we searched bazaar.com was not available, so then we said, what about we use shorteners and add things around that. We started with the word czar is the end and added ly at the end. The domain was available, so that's how we named the company. Random. But nevertheless, that's how we do it. And oftentimes you forget to do things like check to see if it's competitive or any of those kind of things. So that's generally how naming is done. So we decided, can you build a better way to name your company using the scientific method? So we said, let's pick a name 2.0. And we decided with a simple premise of asking. It's just that simple, just ask. So here's how we deployed the scientific method. So we started with step 1, which was sourcing of names. Second one is narrowing of names, and the third one is testing to figure out what's right. So this is the process that was, an actual process was used. So again, 3 steps right here. You source names, as you said, you sent out kind of requests and got lots of inbound leads. But that doesn't help you. If you have tons of names, you just got tons of names. Now how do you pick between them? So the next step was narrowing them, and that's actually where some of the culling is you say, well, what do you think? What do you think? How do we all think about it? Coming up with a process. And the third step is actually testing to pick the name. Now again, all of this assumes that you trust each other enough to trust outside people to name your company. Not everyone's there, and I'm totally okay with that, but again, if you're comfortable saying like, I'm going to trust that other people are going to answer this question for me, we'll do it. So essentially, you source names. These are some examples of places you can do it. There's literally a random name generator on Google. You can go on there and find places. You can go on GoDaddy and just keep typing in names until you find domain names that you want to use. Squad Help is actually what we use, and I'll talk about that a little more. And then you can actually ask friends on Facebook. All of these with the goal of finding a broad list of names. But usually the recommendation is to start with kind of a thematic. What are some of the key things you're thinking about? A one-page summary of what you're doing, or a one-sentence summary of what you're doing. But generally you're trying to source as broadly as possible. You don't necessarily know what it is, but source broad. The next step is actually to create a group of friends, family, co-founders, whatever it is, to actually help narrow. Now, in the example I'm going to talk to you about, we had 250 names that we'd assembled that all of them could be used. That is not something you can test, just to be totally honest. You need to figure out a way to take it from those 200 down. So we actually had a two-step process where we narrowed it down to about 15 and then took an internal team vote on narrowing it down from there down to 5. But again, think about things that are the high-level concept and actually figure out ways to narrow it. Sometimes look for words you want to use or don't want to use, but narrow it down to 3 to 7. And then finally test, and that's what we're going to talk about specifically is the testing process. We actually ran our test through a process that looked at 5 different things: hearability, memorability, image association, competitor association, and general likability. So that's actually the testing protocol that we use, and I'll talk specifically about how it worked. But ultimately, you're asking people what name they think would work based on criteria. Again, if I ask you what you like, I'm just going to get your opinion. But if I asked you based on certain criteria, I'm going to get data that's going to help me make a decision. So this is a process of how it actually worked. And again, I'll send all this stuff out there so you all can use this process, but it actually worked smashingly. So again, we started out with 200 plus names. We sourced those names by using a site called Squad Help. What Squad Help essentially did is we gave them a high sentence summary of what we were trying to do. And literally for $20, people would go out and give us random names that were available. Some of the domain names were the most random things I've ever seen, but all of the names had a .com that was available and had something related to what we were trying to do. Now, I use the term something related to what we tried to do loosely, but we had 200 plus names that were given for us to choose from. From there, we added another 50 from just asking people. So again, we've got 250 names to choose from in this example, all of them across the board. From there, we narrowed it down to 5 with this two-step process of actually, first off, just narrowing it down by what we all liked into a group of 15, and then voting. Literally, it was Roman vote up and down. At the end of the day, we just had to make a decision, but we narrowed it down to 5. And here are the 5 names that we had: Capital Swift, Lendvice, Fund Sorcerer, Finance Keystone, and Directed Funding. Again, the whole idea was, can we do a business that can help small business owners get white glove service on getting loans? So here is our favorites. We ranked what we thought they would be. So number 1 was Lendvice. This is, again, what we thought. So there will be a reveal. Hint, we were wrong. But Lendvice was number 1. Finance Keystone was number 2. Fund Sorcerer, Directed Funding, and Capital Swift. So that was essentially the test that we were going to go on. Those 5 to do right there. Now, it seems random. If I had started this company myself, I would have picked Lendvice. That was what we would have done. But we want to decide how we actually picked it. So what we did is we tested a number of factors. We actually used a system where we created a survey on Mechanical Turk, on SurveyMonkey, and used Mechanical Turk to get over 100 people to take our survey about our name. And again, I'll give you all the instructions on how to do this because it's really a simple thing. It cost no more than $50 to run this entire test and give us a name that we thought was validated, and I could explain why I'd done it. So the first test was hearability. We actually had a woman record the saying of each of these names into a microphone, and then we played them back for the audience, and they actually had to spell out how it was. You can see Lendvice does not spell well when being audibly said. So ultimately, we saw that of those results, it performed very poorly. You can see the ones that performed well, but again, I didn't think about that, right? I thought like, whatever, Lendvice, people got to be able to figure it out, it'll be fine. Again, strike 1 against me. Second thing we looked at was memorability. So again, we said the name of what these companies were. We had them do some random things that they were going to do, some random exercises, and then to come back and actually answer what they remembered. Turned out Fund Sorcerer did not remember well, so it had low memorability. Again, what we were looking for is if we gave you a name, are you going to remember it? The third one, image association. Lendvice was highly correlated to the word vice. not a good word when you're actually trying to give people confidence, trust, and faith. So you see, performed very poorly. Fun sorcerer, Harry Potter was oftentimes in. Witches, also identified in there. Capital Swift also didn't perform quite that well because Capital, Washington, D.C., didn't have a high image association. We also then looked at the feeling association or competitor association. How does this make you feel? And again, Len Weiss did not perform well. So you can see, literally, I was ready to name the company this. Capital Swift, though, had an amazingly high feeling association. People said it made them feel excited and want to participate in there. So the great reveal here is at the end that Capital Swift was the winner. And for those of you who recall, and this is again based on we aggregated those scores and kind of came with a rating of it. But again, do you see how poorly we did here based on using our gut? Now again, whether or not this is the right way to do it, it's a process to do it. Again, it's data-driven decision making. We thought that the best answer in there, the best one was Len Weiss. In all honesty, we paid $100 for that domain name because we thought it was so great in advance. That's stupid. Like, don't do that. And so ultimately we figured out, using data, that the one that we had rated the worst and the second worst were actually the best when actually we'd asked. So what we've just done there is actually saved ourselves a whole bunch of headache by using data to make a decision. And so this is kind of the aha here is we're bad at using our opinions. We just are. And it's okay. But if you essentially step back and let people kind of help you make your decisions using the crowd and using this process, you'll see. So does this kind of make sense as a process here a little bit? Anyone have any general questions on it? Now again, this example here can be used for all sorts of things. And there's plenty of tools that I'll actually share with you afterwards. Tools that people use to actually track web clicks, to track name association, all those kind of things. There's tons and tons and tons of tools, but it's all about using the tools and getting away and saying, I know what to do. You actually don't know. It's better if you ask. And so essentially the lean naming, essentially the start is ask. That's the trick here in actually using lean naming is to ask people. Now again, don't just ask your friends, as I told you. Ask more broadly speaking, and if you're essentially going after bar owners or you're going after moms or something like that, try and limit your audience to that group. We essentially tried to target small business owners in our testing. But again, you'll see, to go back, we as humans are inherently bad at making our own opinions, and so there's ultimately lots of ways to test this. I would say that it probably took us about 4 hours or so to run this test. It might take you a little more because you'll have to set up the survey and do a few other things, but about 4 hours of time and $50 to wind up actually picking the right name. And a little trick, if you buy a domain name on GoDaddy, which I recommend before you run the test, lesson learned, buy the domain name so someone doesn't snatch it up while they're taking your test. Little tip. You actually can return it within 5 days. So if you run this test within 5 days and then return the domain names, GoDaddy won't charge you the $9.99. So there's a little, save you guys $40 right just there.